He won 3 aircraft carrier battles in a row, the only American admiral who ever did it, and then the United States Navy buried him alive in the fog of Alaska and made sure his name would not be the one your history books remembered. This is the story of Frank Jack Fletcher, and of how a war hero became a ghost. The carrier came home bleeding. She trailed a long slick of black oil across the green waters of Pearl Harbor, her flight deck scorched, the bomb hole in her hull punched clean through 4 decks where 66 men had died. The yard workers swarmed aboard before the mooring lines were even fast. They had been told there were 90 days of repair work in front of them. They were given 3, and the admiral who had brought that wounded ship home, a quiet, balding man from a farm in Iowa, walked off the USS Yorktown and straight into the office of the most powerful naval officer in the Pacific. His uniform was salt-stained. He had not slept properly in weeks. He had just come from the first carrier battle in human history, and he had come home with one of his 2 flat tops missing and the other half killed beneath his feet. He answered for what he had done out in the Coral Sea. He answered well, because 2 days later, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, sat down at his desk and wrote a private letter to the man who could end any career in the United States Navy with a single signature. Admiral Ernest J. King, a man so feared that subordinates joked he shaved with a blowtorch, and in that letter Nimitz said this: Fletcher did a fine job. He exercised superior judgment. He is an excellent seagoing fighting naval officer. Nimitz recommended him for promotion to Vice Admiral. He recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal. He defended him point by point, decision by decision, against the criticism that had already begun to drift down from Washington. 4 months later, that same fighting naval officer was finished, not dead, not court-martialed, not disgraced in any public recordable way. He was just gone, sent north into the fog and the freezing williwaw winds of the Aleutian Islands to command a frozen backwater where no Japanese carrier would ever come and no decisive battle would ever be fought. He would never command an aircraft carrier task force again, not for the rest of the war, not ever. The one American admiral who had won 3 carrier battles in a row, the only man alive who could say that, spent the rest of the Pacific War guarding Alaska. So here is the question. The man Nimitz called excellent, the man Nimitz personally tried to promote and decorate, the man who, more than almost any other single human being, had helped to turn the tide of the war in the Pacific in the spring and summer of 1942. He was quietly removed from the very war he had won. Why? Who decided that Frank Jack Fletcher was no longer worth keeping? And what does the real answer tell us about how the United States Navy actually worked in the year 1942? Most of you already know the easy version of this story. The Navy got rid of Fletcher because he was timid, because he was always worrying about his fuel, because he lost 2 carriers, because, in the cruel one-word verdict of one of his fellow admirals, he ran. I have spent a long time inside the records on this one, and I am going to tell you straight out that the easy version is not just incomplete. In several important places it is simply false. The truth is messier, it is more human, and in some ways it is far more damning than the legend. So let me begin with the single biggest thing that the popular story gets wrong, because it changes everything else that follows. Nimitz did not replace Fletcher after Midway. He did not replace him in June of 1942. He did not replace him in July. He did not replace him in August. Here is the actual sequence, and I want you to hold on to it, because the timeline is the whole argument. Fletcher commanded at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May. He was the senior tactical commander at the Battle of Midway in early June. And then, he stayed in command. He sailed south with 3 aircraft carriers under his flag, and he covered the marine landings on Guadalcanal in August. He fought and won a 3rd carrier battle, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, on the 24th of August. And 1 week after that, on the last day of August, a Japanese submarine put a torpedo into his flagship and blew him bodily across the bridge and opened a gash on his forehead. He rowed the crippled carrier back to Pearl Harbor, arriving on the 21st of September. He went on his first leave since before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And only then, sometime in the autumn, did the orders quietly come. He was not relieved on a flag bridge in the smoke of battle. He was eased out on dry land while he was recovering from a head wound, almost without anyone ever saying the words out loud. That distinction matters more than it might sound, because a man who is relieved for cause gets a reason on paper. A man who is simply not brought back gets nothing, no charge, no hearing, no chance to defend himself, and that, as you will see, is exactly what happened to Frank Jack Fletcher. So before we put him on trial, let me show you who the prosecution wants you to believe was a coward. A young lieutenant, Veracruz, Mexico, April of 1914. The United States is intervening on the Mexican coast. The harbor is full of fire and smoke and panic. American civilians and refugees are trying to escape the city, and a young naval officer named Frank Jack Fletcher takes command of a refugee transport called the Esperanza and gets her out into the stream under hostile fire. He does not leave her until she is safely past the men of war and clear of the rocks. The next morning he goes back. He takes a refugee train under a flag of truce through territory the Mexicans were believed to have mined. He brings the people out. For that, the United States gives him the highest decoration this country awards a sailor, the Medal of Honor. 4 years later, in the First World War, he commands a destroyer escorting convoys through waters that are thick with German submarines, and he wins the Navy Cross. This is the man the prosecution wants you to believe flinched in the year 1942, the man whose physical courage they want you to question. Whatever Fletcher's caution would later be, it was not the caution of a frightened man. Hold that. Now let me tell you something else the easy story gets wrong from the very first month of the war. In December of 1941, the Marine garrison of Wake Island is dying. A relief expedition is sent. It is built around the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga. And the commander of that task force, Task Force 14, is Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. He is steaming hard toward Wake when the order comes. Turn around. The order is not Fletcher's. The order is sent by the acting commander of the Pacific Fleet, a man named Vice Admiral William Pye, who has the job for only a few days, in the gap between the man who lost Pearl Harbor and the man who would inherit it. Pye looks at the intelligence, looks at the risk to his last aircraft carrier, and he calls Fletcher home. Wake falls. The historian Samuel Eliot Morison, who would later become the harshest of all Fletcher's critics, admitted in print that this call was Pye's call. Not Fletcher's. Pye gave the order. Pye signed the message. But Fletcher was the man on the bridge. Fletcher was the admiral who turned the ships around. And the Marines who held Wake to the last, the ones who were captured, and the ones who never came home from the prison camps, never forgot that the Navy had come within 425 miles of them and then sailed away. The stink of that decision settled onto Frank Jack Fletcher. It never settled onto William Pye. That is the first piece of injustice in this story. There will be many more, so let me show you the case against him. The whole case, where it built up slowly over the longest 9 months of his life. Because to understand what happened to Fletcher, you have to understand 4 separate accusations. They started small, they came from different people, from different parts of the Navy, for different reasons. But by the autumn of 1942, they had braided themselves together into a single rope, and that rope was long enough to hang him with. Charge 1. He was by temperament too cautious, a careful man in a job that demanded a gambler. Charge 2. He lost the USS Lexington at the Coral Sea. An earnest king who never forgave a sunken ship would never forgive him for it. Charge 3. He abandoned the United States Marines on the beach at Guadalcanal, and the worst surface defeat in American naval history happened the very next night. Charge 4. The quietest charge, the one that hurt him most. He was the wrong kind of officer. He was a black shoe in a brown shoe job, and an entire civil war was being fought inside the Navy over who would own the future. And Frank Jack Fletcher was standing in the way. Behind all 4 of those charges, patient as winter, sat Ernest King. And there is one more figure you need to know about, because she is the silent third character in this story. The cruiser Fletcher would step onto when his own flagship was burning beneath him at Midway, a heavy cruiser, hull number CA-34. The USS Astoria, remember that name. 66 days after she carried Frank Jack Fletcher away from his greatest victory, she would be at the bottom of the sea. and the loss of her, and 3 of her sisters, would become the single most damning piece of evidence the prosecution would ever have. That is where this story is going, but the verdict, when we get there, is going to be yours. So let us call the court to order. The prosecution will present 4 charges. They were not delivered in a single moment. They accumulated like silt on a wound over the 289 days between the attack on Pearl Harbor and the autumn of 1942. And in those days, Frank Jack Fletcher spent 238 of them at sea, more than any other American admiral in the Pacific. While the case against him was being quietly built ashore, it starts in January. The United States had been at war for 6 weeks. The Pacific Fleet was, by any honest accounting, broken, and someone in Washington had decided that the carriers, the few precious carriers that the bombs had missed, needed to go out and hit something. Anything, to show the country that the Navy was still alive. So Frank Jack Fletcher took his task force into the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, and he raided the Japanese garrisons there in late January of 1942. The raid did real damage. It cost the Japanese real ships, and one thing about it, just one thing, drove Ernest King to a cold and lasting fury. Fletcher had refueled his destroyers, again and again and again. The carriers of 1942 could steam for weeks without seeing a tanker. The destroyers could not. They burned oil at a frantic rate, and they were forever drinking from the larger ships, and Fletcher seemed almost incapable of going into a fight without topping his small boys off one more time. Even, the records suggest, on days when the fuel logs said they had plenty. King saw this in the dispatches from his office in Washington. And King, in his desk chair, 3,000 miles from the smell of the salt and the diesel, fired off a message so sharp that one of Fletcher's own cruiser commanders, a man named William Ward Smith, read it and looked across the bridge at Fletcher and said something that survives in the records. That is the stinkingest message I have ever read. Fletcher took the paper, he read it, he set it down. He said 5 words, "I am not perturbed," but Ernest King was, and here is the part the easy version of the story leaves out. Because the easy version says King was being a tyrant, maybe, but King was not wrong about the fuel. Fletcher really did refuel constantly. He topped off his destroyers in situations where another man would have closed the distance and struck. To his critics, this looked like a commander whose first instinct in a crisis was to glance at a gauge instead of at the enemy. The aircraft carrier was a weapon of speed, surprise, audacity, and here was an admiral who treated it like a battleship that needed careful housekeeping. That charge is not imaginary, it is not invented. You can read it in the war diaries. We will come back to it. But first, before we sail down into the Coral Sea, you have to see one moment, because this one moment, more than anything else, tells you who Fletcher actually was on the inside. The Battle of the Coral Sea was about to begin. It was going to be the first battle in human history fought entirely by aircraft launched from ships that never saw each other. 2 American carriers against 2 Japanese fleet carriers and a light carrier, and the man in command of those 2 American flat tops was a surface officer who had never earned a pilot's wings. He knew it. So when Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch arrived in the task force, Fletcher's Annapolis classmate from the year 1906, a genuine aviator, a man who had spent his whole career flying off pitching decks, Fletcher made a decision that would have killed the ego of most flag officers. He gave Fitch tactical control of the air battle. He kept overall command. The strategic decisions stayed with him. But the actual moving of the squadrons, the timing of the launches, the recovery of the strikes, the close work of carrier aviation, he handed it to the man who understood it best. That is not the act of a coward. That is not the act of a small man. That is the act of a professional who knew his weapon was a team. And not a sword in his own hand. Remember that. The aviators, the brown shoe community, would later call Fletcher an interloper. A black shoe holding their job. This is the interloper who, at the first carrier battle ever fought, gave a brown shoe the controls. The battle itself was a confused, groping, 2-day affair. Neither side could find the other cleanly. Scout reports were garbled. Both fleets launched full strikes against the wrong ships. The Japanese sank an American oiler called the Neosho and a destroyer called the Sims, while the real American carriers sailed on untouched, hundreds of miles away. The American strike that should have gone after the big Japanese carriers went instead against a light covering force. Both admirals were firing blind across an empty ocean, trying to guess where the other man's flight decks were before the other man guessed first. That is what Fletcher was actually doing out there, not consulting a fuel gauge, solving a lethal puzzle in real time with half the pieces missing. And on the strategic scoreboard he won. His aircraft sank the Japanese light carrier Shoho in 11 minutes. The radio call from the lead pilot has gone down in American naval history. Scratch 1 flat top. His bombs put the big carrier Shokaku out of the war for 2 months. His fighters and his bombers tore so badly into the air group of the carrier Zuikaku that she could not fight either. And because of those 2 ships, the Japanese had to cancel their invasion of Port Moresby. And because those 2 carriers were missing from the Japanese order of battle 4 weeks later, the Battle of Midway became a battle the United States could actually win. That is the strategic ledger. But the men in Washington did not see ledgers. They saw a number, 216 American sailors dead. The Lexington took 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs, and the damage was survivable. What was not survivable was what happened next. Aviation gasoline vapor pooled below decks, touched off. A chain of internal explosions tore the great ship apart from the inside, slowly, hour by hour, until almost nothing was left but a burning hulk drifting in the Coral Sea. Most of her crew was taken off. Almost 3,000 men were saved. But the ship was dying and could not be towed, and the United States Navy was not going to leave her for the Japanese to find. The destroyer USS Phelps, hull number DD-360, fired the torpedoes that put her under. She rolled over and she went. And in the mind of Ernest King, 3,000 miles away in Washington, a calculation crystallized that would never thaw. King would never forgive Fletcher for the loss of the Lexington, not after the victory, not after Midway, not after the Eastern Solomons. Never, that is the second charge, and it was filed by the most powerful enemy a wartime admiral can have. But the trial is not over. The biggest battle of the man's life is still in front of him, and so is the moment that should have settled the question of his nerve for all time. And it is in that moment that I want to put a name into your head, and I want you to keep it there. USS Astoria, heavy cruiser, hull number CA-34, remember her. The Battle of Midway opens on the 4th of June 1942. Fletcher is the senior officer present at the carrier engagement, the overall tactical commander. His flag flies in the Yorktown, the same ship the yard had patched together in 3 days instead of 90. She is steaming into the most important naval battle of the 20th century with her boilers damaged, her power plant patched together by exhausted men working around the clock. She cannot do better than 27 knots. Under him, in command of the other American task force, the Enterprise and the Hornet, is a man almost no one in the fleet knew well. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser officer with about 1 week of carrier experience to his name. The man who should have been there, the famous brown shoe carrier Admiral William Halsey, is at that moment lying in a hospital bed in Hawaii. He has a body covered in dermatitis so severe that he cannot sleep. He has lost 20 pounds. He has begged Nimitz to give the job to Spruance. So Spruance has the job. At 10:25 on the morning of the 4th of June, dive bombers from both American task forces arrived over the Japanese carriers at the same instant. By one of the great coincidences in the history of warfare, they fell from the sky in a single coordinated dive that no one had actually coordinated. And in 5 murderous minutes, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu were on fire and finished. The Yorktown's own aircraft helped to break the Soryu. The Japanese struck back, and the Yorktown, dragging her damaged power plant, took bombs, took torpedoes, and went dead in the water. Fletcher, on the flag bridge of a dying ship, did something I want you to picture clearly. He did not freeze. He did not cling to overall command for the prestige of holding it. With his flagship unable to launch or recover aircraft, with no way to coordinate the rest of the battle from where he stood, at 11 minutes past 6 on the evening of the 4th of June, he transferred his flag to a heavy cruiser steaming nearby, the USS Astoria, CA-34, and he signalled Raymond Spruance, the man who held the Enterprise and the Hornet and the air strength that would decide of the battle, 4 words. "We will conform to your movements. He handed the battle to the man who could still fight it. Spruance, in his entire long life after the war, was always honest about what he received. By the time Frank Jack Fletcher passed him the baton, by the time he stepped onto the Astoria and gave Spruance the deck, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers were already burning beyond saving. The battle, in Spruance's own words, was already won. Spruance would go on to make the cold, correct decisions of the night that followed and the day after. The decision to retire to the east to avoid the surface guns of the Japanese battleships, the decision to come back at dawn. Those were brilliant calls. He earned every shred of the credit he received for them. But the man who had set the chessboard, the man who had been the senior commander present at the most important American naval victory of the 20th century, was already being erased. Some Navy histories written in 1943, while the war was still being fought, left Fletcher's name out of the Midway story altogether. The senior commander of Midway disappeared from the record of his own victory before the war was over, and now I want you to see the cruiser one more time. The USS Astoria, the ship that carried Fletcher away from his greatest victory. 66 days after the evening of the 4th of June, the Astoria will be at the bottom of the sea. Off a small island called Savo, inside an hour, most of her crew lost in the darkness, and the loss of her and 3 of her sisters will become the single piece of evidence the prosecution uses to finish the man whose flag had once flown from her mast. That brings us to the 3rd charge, and to Guadalcanal. On the 7th of August 1942, the United States launched its first offensive of the entire war. The Marines came ashore on Guadalcanal and on a smaller island called Tulagi. The men who were there called it Operation Shoestring. Because every supply, every fuel can, every rifle, every shell was scraped together from a country that had not yet finished mobilizing. Frank Jack Fletcher, now a vice admiral, commanded the whole expeditionary force from his flagship Saratoga, 3 carriers under him. Saratoga, Enterprise, Wasp. The amphibious force, the transports with the Marines, was run by Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. The Marines on the beach were led by Major General Alexander Vandergrift. Days before the landing, in a planning conference aboard the Saratoga, Fletcher told the others something they did not want to hear. He said his carriers could only stay tied to the beachhead for 2 days. Vandergrift said he needed at least 4 to get his men and their supplies ashore. Turner backed the Marines. Fletcher grudgingly stretched to 3. Then the landings happened, and the unloading fell behind schedule, the way unloading always does in war. On the evening of the 8th of August, with the work only partly done, Fletcher sent the message that would define the rest of his life. He reported that his fighter strength had been cut from 99 aircraft down to 78 in 2 days of fighting. He noted that Japanese torpedo planes were operating in the area. He recommended the immediate withdrawal of the carriers. He asked for tankers to be sent forward. His superior, the South Pacific commander, Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, approved the withdrawal. Fletcher took the carriers and pulled south. And in the black, early morning hours of the 9th of August, the worst happened. A Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa came down the channel between the islands and fell on the Allied screening ships in the dark. In about 32 minutes, the Japanese sank 4 heavy cruisers, the Vincennes, the Quincy, the Astoria, the Australian ship Canberra. More than 1,000 Allied sailors died in barely half an hour. It was, and it remains, the worst open water defeat in the history of the United States Navy. And the cruiser that had carried Frank Jack Fletcher away from the burning Yorktown at Midway, the USS Astoria, was at the bottom. The Marines never forgot it. They invented a sardonic decoration they called the George Medal, showing a Navy sleeve dropping a hot potato into a Marine's open hand, and the motto, "Let George do it." To Vandergrift, to the Marines who would starve and shiver on that island for months, and above all to Kelly Turner, who in 1945 would actually use the word desertion. Fletcher had run. He had taken his carriers and run, and good men had paid for it. That is the charge that did the real damage. Because it gave Ernest King an ally he had never had before. It is one thing for the commander-in-chief of the fleet to dislike you. It is another thing for the United States Marine Corps to despise you at the same moment. So now follow me here. because the easy version of the story breaks against a fact that the prosecution will not tell you. Fletcher's carriers were more than 100 miles to the south. Savo Island was a night surface action, cruisers and destroyers gun to gun, in pitch darkness. Carrier aircraft in 1942 could not fight at night. They could not, the technology did not exist. Mikawa attacked at night precisely because he knew that the moment the sun came up, American planes would own the sky and tear his cruisers apart. Even if Fletcher had not moved, even if every carrier in his command had been sitting right off Savo with full magazines, the planes on those decks could not have flown. Savo Island was a catastrophe of surface screening, a failure of the ships actually responsible for guarding the anchorage that night. It was not, and could not have been, prevented by aircraft 100 miles away, and do you know who said so in the records at the time? Colonel Melvin Mars, a United States Marine, a man serving on Fletcher's own staff. He wrote that the carriers had to be kept fueled and mobile, that tying them to the beach was inviting disaster, a Marine officer defending the Navy Admiral against the Marine generals who would condemn him. But Silk does not care about evidence. The story took root anyway, because human beings need somebody to blame for 1,000 dead sailors in 32 minutes. And Frank Jack Fletcher was the man who had sailed away. 2 weeks later, the man almost everyone in the Navy had now decided was a coward fought his third carrier battle. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The 24th of August, 1942. Admiral Yamamoto in Tokyo had sent a reinforcement force south to recapture the airfield the Marines had taken on Guadalcanal. He sent it under the cover of his carriers, and he pushed the light carrier Ryujo forward as bait. Fletcher's dive bombers from the Saratoga found her in the afternoon and put her on the bottom that same evening. The Japanese struck back. They hit the Enterprise with 3 bombs. One of those bombs set off an ammunition explosion that killed about 74 men in a single instant. And here is the operational detail almost no one remembers. The Enterprise was so well drilled, her damage control parties so good, that she was recovering her own returning aircraft inside of about 1 hour after being hit. The Japanese reinforcement convoy turned back. Fletcher's force had shot roughly 70 Japanese aircraft out of the sky for the loss of about 20 of their own. And the Japanese aircrew were the part of the equation that the enemy could not replace. It was a clear American victory. The third in a row under the same commander. And King's reaction was not gratitude. King criticized Fletcher for not chasing the retreating Japanese fleet into the night, into a surface battle, against a force that was superior in surface guns and ready for exactly that fight. But here is the truth no friend of Fletcher should hide. On the afternoon of the 23rd of August, the day before Eastern Solomons, Fletcher detached one of his 3 precious carriers, the USS Wasp, and sent her south to refuel. He went into the fight at 2/3 strength, by choice. That was a real mistake, a genuine costly operational error made by a man whose habits of refueling had finally caught up with him at the worst possible moment. We do not have to defend it. He won the battle anyway, but it was an error, and the brown shoe community noticed. And here is the cruel irony of what would happen 1 year later. In November of 1943, the United States invaded the atoll of Tarawa. And the admiral commanding the carriers at Tarawa made the very same decision Fletcher had made at Guadalcanal. He refused to anchor his carriers to the landing beaches. He kept them mobile. That admiral was Raymond Spruance. Spruance made Fletcher's call, for Fletcher's reasons, and Spruance was praised for his prudence, for his operational wisdom, the exact same judgment from 2 black shoe admirals 15 months apart. One was condemned as a coward. The other was canonized. And the most senior aviator in the Navy, the same Vice Admiral John Towers, who had written the words he ran away in his diary about Fletcher and Guadalcanal, by the time of Tarawa Towers himself was arguing against tying the carriers down to the invasion beach. The doctrine had not changed, only the name of the man being judged. 1 week after the third victory, 1 week after the Ryujo went down, on the 31st of August 1942, the Japanese submarine I-26 was waiting under a hot calm sea about 240 nautical miles southeast of Guadalcanal. She put a single torpedo into the starboard side of the USS Saratoga. The torpedo flooded a fire room and knocked out the great carrier's electric drive. She went dead in the water. The heavy cruiser USS Minneapolis took her under tow. On the flag bridge, Fletcher was thrown against something hard. The blow opened a deep cut across his forehead. A pharmacist's mate came up with a roll of gauze and a bandage and patched the admiral by lantern light. 12 men aboard the Saratoga were wounded by the explosion. Not one of them was killed, but Fletcher's flagship was crippled and bound for the repair yard. And Fletcher himself was a wounded man who had been at sea, almost without a break, for 9 of the cruelest months in the history of the United States Navy. The Saratoga limped home. Fletcher arrived at Pearl Harbor on the 21st of September. He went on his first leave since before the Japanese attack. And while he slept in a real bed for the first time in nearly a year, 4,000 miles away in Washington, a quiet decision was already being made about him. It was not being made by the man whose name is in the title of this story. It was being made by every single one of his enemies. At once. So now we can ask the question the title of this story was built to ask. If Fletcher was as good as the record says, if he won every carrier battle he fought, if Nimitz himself had written, in his own hand, that the man was an excellent fighting officer, why did the Navy let him go? The honest answer is not a single villain. There is no signed order. There is no memo. The historian John Lundstrom spent decades inside the dispatch files and the personal papers of Admiral King, looking for a single piece of paper on which someone in authority had written the words "Relieve Fletcher." It is not there. It does not exist. What exists instead is something colder. 9 months of quiet corrosion, the stinkingest message in January. King's open uneasiness in person about letting Fletcher command at the Coral Sea at all. King's refusal, even after the victory in May, to act on Nimitz's recommendation that the man be decorated. King's preference for Halsey before Midway. King's complaint after Eastern Solomons that Fletcher had not chased the enemy into the night. 9 months of small cuts, none of them fatal, all of them remembered, and there is one piece of this that I think you need to hear, because of all the parts of this story, it is the saddest. The man whose name is in the title of this video, the man people remember as the one who let Fletcher go, was actually the last person inside the United States Navy who believed in him. You have to understand who Chester Nimitz was. In the summer of 1908, on the 7th of July, a young naval officer, not yet 30 years old, ran his ship aground. The destroyer USS Decatur. The bottom for Batangas Harbor in the Philippines reached up and grabbed her, and she sat there in the mud until tugs came to pull her off. The young officer was court-martialed. His career came within an inch of ending right there, on a Philippine sandbar. His superiors gave him a letter of reprimand and a second chance. That young officer's name was Chester William Nimitz. He never forgot it. For the rest of his life, he carried a deep, lived conviction that a good officer who made an honest mistake deserved another opportunity. Not a firing squad of paperwork. That conviction is exactly why he defended Fletcher to King after the Coral Sea. Why he kept him in command at Midway over King's reservations, why he sent him south to Guadalcanal. Nimitz was the shield. For 9 months, Nimitz was the only reason Fletcher still had a job, but every shield has a breaking point. And after the Eastern Solomons, for the first time, Nimitz wrote that the Navy needed to use its surface ships more boldly. That the Saratoga should have stood her ground on the night of the 24th instead of pulling south. The shield did not shatter. It just slowly lowered, and while it was lowering, in the quiet wood-panelled corridors of the headquarters at Pearl Harbor, something else had happened that nobody outside the Navy would ever fully understand. Something that, in my view, decided this whole thing as long before the torpedo from the I-26 ever hit the Saratoga. On the 18th of June, 1942, only 11 days after the Battle of Midway, while Frank Jack Fletcher was still at sea, still in command, still carrying the weight of 3/4 of America's surviving carrier force on his shoulders. Raymond Spruance became Nimitz's chief of staff. Day after day in the months that followed, Spruance sat at Nimitz's elbow. He helped plan the entire future of the Pacific War. He became the trusted hand, the known quantity, the man whose voice the boss was hearing first every single morning. And 6,000 miles away, in the smoke and the diesel and the long swells of the South Pacific, the other man, the man who had won the battles, was simply not in the building. If you have ever in your working life watched the person who actually delivered the results out in the field be quietly passed over in favor of the person who stayed back at headquarters and managed the relationship, then you already understand something the official histories do not quite say out loud. The Navy of 1942 would feel right at home in any large organization in the United States today. The man who took the risks was wounded, riding a broken ship home. The man who would inherit the war was in the office. When Fletcher finally reached Pearl Harbor on the 21st of September, Nimitz gave him his first leave of the entire war. And there is real evidence, hidden in the dispatches that Lundstrom read 60 years later, that Nimitz at first intended to bring him back, to give him the Saratoga Task Force again once the carrier was repaired. But by the 18th of October, William Halsey was healthy again. The dermatitis had cleared, he was aggressive, he was an aviator, and the South Pacific was screaming for a fighter. Halsey took the whole command, and the plan to bring Fletcher back, if it had ever truly been firm, dissolved. Nobody had to relieve him, they only had to not call him. By November, Fletcher had orders to Seattle, then onward to the North Pacific. The Aleutians, the fog, the Willie War winds. For the rest of the war, the Navy that produced him had not so much fired him as forgotten to keep him. And in some ways that is worse. A relief leaves a record, a quiet sidelining leaves only silence, and silence is the easiest thing in the world to fill with a lie. I am not going to leave you with a man without flaws, because that would not be true either, and the audience for this story deserves better than a hagiography. His refueling habit really was excessive. It cost him operational tempo more than once. His decision to detach off the afternoon before Eastern Solomons, leaving himself at 2/3 strength on the eve of a battle, was a genuine tactical error. He was a surface officer by instinct right to the end. He flew his flag in a cruiser at Eastern Solomons instead of a carrier. A small thing, but a telling one, and his communication with Kelly Turner in the hours before he pulled the carriers from Guadalcanal was abrupt and clumsy. It poisoned a relationship that the Navy could not afford to poison. Fletcher was a fine combat commander, he was not a politician. And in the savage internal knife fight of 1942, that mattered a great deal, but the largest mistake he ever made was not made in any battle. It was made afterward. When the war ended and the historians came calling, Fletcher would not play the game. He had lost most of his personal records and command papers when the Yorktown sank at Midway. And he lost still more when he was carried wounded off the Saratoga. Rather than reconstruct events from memory and risk getting a single fact wrong, he refused. He would not sit for Samuel Eliot Morrison's interviews. He would not write the articles. He would not give the speeches. He would not polish his own legend. He let his enemies tell his story, and his enemies told it for 50 years. And then there is one more thing, the thing that lifts this above one man's bad luck and makes it the story of an institution. Because Fletcher was not just unlucky, he was an early casualty of a shift that was going to happen no matter what he did. The Brown Shoe faction was winning the long Civil War for the soul of the Navy. They were winning it for a perfectly good reason. The carrier had become the decisive weapon. The aviators understood it best, and in 1944 Ernest King made it official. He decreed that any non-aviator commanding a fleet or a task force had to have an aviator as his chief of staff. And he raised those chiefs of staff to flag rank to make the point stick. That single order ended the careers of the gun club admirals as carrier commanders. It settled the question forever in the aviators' favor. Frank Jack Fletcher, the black shoe who had won 3 carrier battles, was simply the first prominent body the tide carried away. His removal in 1942 was not an accident inside the system, it was the system beginning to sort itself out, with Fletcher standing in the wrong place when it did. So let me put the numbers in front of you one last time. Because the numbers of the closing argument the man himself was too modest to make. 3 carrier battles fought, 3 carrier battles won. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers sent to the bottom on his watch: the Shoho at the Coral Sea, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu at Midway. The Ryujo at the Eastern Solomons, against 2 American carriers lost, the Lexington and the Yorktown. In the first 289 days of the Pacific War, Fletcher spent 51 days ashore. Every other day he was at sea, in harm's way, carrying the entire ocean on the decks of 2 or 3 ships. No other American admiral in 1942 came anywhere close to that record. Nobody did. In 2006, after a lifetime of work in the dispatch files, John Lundstrom finally published the book that turned half a century of conventional wisdom on its head. Black Shoe Carrier Admiral. The author Evan Thomas summed it up in a single sentence: "It is very difficult to turn around 50 years of conventional wisdom." But Lundstrom proved that Jack Fletcher deserves to be remembered as a hero and not a goat. Fletcher himself never lived to see it. He retired as a full admiral in 1947. In September of 1945, he was the senior American officer present at the Japanese surrender ceremony in the Northern Islands. He died in 1973, and for most of those years, the country he had served at sea for almost the entire opening year of its greatest war remembered him, when it remembered him at all, as the admiral who ran. Let me leave you with one image. When the USS Yorktown was struck by torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-168 on the 6th of June, 2 days after the Battle of Midway had already been decided, the destroyer that had been lashed alongside her, trying to save her, was hit by that same submarine. The USS Hammond, hull number DD-412, she broke in 2, she went under in less than 4 minutes. Roughly 80 of her men died with her, and many of them were killed not by the torpedo. They were killed by their own depth charges, which detonated as the ship sank around them, in the water among the swimming survivors. That is the sea. It does not grant a clean death. It does not grant a second chance. Every decision Frank Jack Fletcher made on those flag bridges, every choice about when to launch and when to turn and when to pull away, was a decision measured not in tonnage, but in men in the water. He understood that better than the men in Washington who judged him, because he was the one who had to stand there and watch it happen. So that is the case. You have heard the charges, you have heard the defense, you have heard the names of the dead and the numbers of the living, and the small private decision a young ensign named Nimitz never forgot. This time, the verdict is yours. I will see you in the next one.